Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the universe, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today we're going to be talking about an album I recently discovered on Bandcamp. It was released in December last year. It's by a Belgian pianist whose name is something like Frederik Croene, and the album is called Saint-Retour, or Saint-Retour, I don't know, my French is not good. Disclaimer. Also, disclaimer, my knowledge of classical music is patchy. I'm trying to learn more about it. This album is a kind of conceptual, classical suite of pieces, or it's conceived of as a kind of whole work in the tradition of Beethoven. It's also kind of conceived as a piano recital, but I think you're going to find it really interesting because the conceptual background of the album and how this comes to expression in the music is really, really fascinating. So the album is part of a trilogy that I don't really know very much about or understand. I've only just come to this musician, and this album is the first thing I've heard by him, but it's the third in a series of albums that in different ways are about climate change and about grief or sadness around climate change. And this album particularly is about the fantasy of escape, of escaping the planet that you might have encountered, in, for example, Elon Musk's ridiculous fantasies about escaping to Mars, and how this fantasy is just that, an impossible fantasy that cushions us against the reality of our damaged environment. And the metaphor that Frederik Croene has used to try to explore this is different avian pioneers, different pioneers of flight, all of whom died in plane accidents, or at least in plane crashes. Not all of them were accidents. So it's 6 pieces, all performed on the piano, all quite different. They blend into each other when you listen to it, and they are all in memoriam of different people. I'm going to go through the different 6, talk about the stories of the people in question, and a little bit about the music. So the first track of this album, the opening of the suite, you begin by hearing a recording of Yuri Gagarin, the Soviet national hero, talking to Mission Control right before the first successful manned flight into space. And you hear the rumbling of the engines of the spaceship about to take off in and go outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And this rumbling then becomes the background for the beginning of the piano. Yuri Gagarin was the first man into space, and he was originally a pilot who then trained as a cosmonaut. When he became a famous Soviet hero and icon, the Soviet government told him that he could no longer fly spaceships. So he went back to being a military pilot, and paradoxically, ironically, tragically, he died in an aeroplane crash. The music of this piece, In Memoriam Yuri Gagarin, 27th of the 3rd, 1968, the day of his death, starts with a kind of repetitive figure in the left hand on the piano, the lower notes, and then you hear chords which are somewhat atonal, slightly dissonant. I don't know a lot about Russian classical music, but I thought about the way that Soviet music, at least in the beginning, was supposed to be very modernist and experimental, and I wondered whether Croene was kind of referencing some of the more dissonant aspects of Soviet music. A lot of the piece is based around this kind of repetition with different variations, but towards the end it comes to move away from this at different points. At one stage it kind of moves into the same rhythmic figure but on a different chord, and then it goes into a more hectic section, and then it turns into almost like a sound image of the engines of the spaceship that we've already heard on the lower notes on the piano. This is kind of more frightening. Either the you might think of the fear of the spaceship taking off, or you might also think of the sound of the plane shaking as it's about to crash, that perhaps this is like two sounds that echo one another. And then towards the end there is something much more beautiful, a kind of call and return figure on the piano that makes me think about the stars in the night sky, about space, about outer space, about Yuri Gagarin again, the cosmonaut. Track 2, Queen Bess, In Memoriam, Bessie Coleman, the 30th of the 4th, 1926. Queen Bess, or Bessie Coleman, was the first African American, the first Native American, and the first woman to hold a pilot's license in America. She always wanted to be a pilot, but America at the time, they didn't allow women or African Americans into flight school to become pilots. So she had to go to France. And I think that's interesting in relationship to the music, because this piece is more immediately accessible, a little more melodic, and it might remind you of Jan Tiersen, or maybe even of Erik Satie, who are both French pianists. It makes me think of France in the early 20th century. As the music starts to shift later, it becomes a situation where there's different melodies that almost seem to be in different keys, and that reminds me more of Stravinsky, kind of going back to the Russian influence. Now, Coleman, like several other people this album references, she used to perform in air shows. Unfortunately, she was on the way to an air show when her new airplane that she had bought had a fault, and she was thrown from the aircraft, and because she was planning a parachute jump, so she didn't have a belt on, and she fell to her death. At the end of this piece again becomes kind of more threatening, a little more intense. It might remind you in some way of that tailspin or her falling to her death. At the very end of Queen Bess, you hear a new voice. This is the voice of Richard Russell, Sky King, In Memoriam, 10th of the 8th, 2018, the most recent of the people that this album is honouring. Some of you may remember this news story. Richard Russell worked at the Seattle airport. He was working on the ground. He was not trained as any kind of pilot. And one day he just took a plane. He had no flight experience, and he flew around over the state of Washington. Air traffic control managed to get into conversation with him, and this conversation was broadcast on the internet, so it's like available. And this piece is a very subtle, very open piece with very pretty figures, often quite high up on the keys on the piano, very spacey, and it gives me this sense of maybe being able to look out of the window as you're flying, and then at the same time it's made strangely poignant by the sound of Richard Russell and air traffic control kind of seeping into this musical picture, and you hear him describing himself as somebody who has a screw loose, asking whether he'll be sent to prison if he lands the plane. He seems kind of confused by his own actions, and it makes me have the sense that almost this peaceful, beautiful background music has something slightly dissociative about it. In the true story of Sky King Richard Russell, he was able to execute a very difficult barrel roll of the plane, something that perhaps he'd always wanted to do, and then he deliberately crashed. Nobody else was hurt, but he did not survive. The piece following, this kind of soft, poignant, sad piece about Richard Russell, couldn't be more different. It's called Kamikaze, In Memoriam, Yukio Seki, 25th of the 10th, 1944. Yukio Seki was the first person to lead a successful kamikaze mission from the Japanese military during the Second World War. Now, I don't know much about him, but I read the Wikipedia entry, and it was kind of interesting because we often think of kamikaze pilots as being driven by this sense of national honor and military pride. But Yukio Seki seems to have stated that he saw his kamikaze mission as a way of protecting his wife. He cared more about his wife than his homeland. If Japan lost the war, he thought his wife could be assaulted by American servicemen, and he saw himself as dying for somebody that he loves. Now, the music is, a little bit like the piece about Gagarin. It has a very repetitive line in the left hand of the piano, with these weird kind of collections of notes up in the high notes on the piano, and there's continual variations around this. Now, the sound to it for me has this very kind of like somber, almost military, but also funereal tone to it. A little threatening, maybe a sense of doom. My fantasy about this is that this is his kind of prevailing emotional state as he is going through all of the preparations and training and military practices necessary to carry out this mission. And then there are small moments in the piece where it changes entirely and there's different sections. So there's one part that suddenly emerges that sounds very beautiful, almost like the music from a romantic film. And it makes me think about his wife and this love, this protective feeling that he had, and his idea that he was in some way sacrificing himself for love. Then back to this funereal, repetitive, slightly unsettling music, and then a new section that again is a little bit more melodic but more edgy than the first time. In my mind, I imagine him climbing into the cockpit, and the end of the piece, it's very difficult not to visualize the planes kind of falling from the sky into the ocean or hitting the boats. It sounds to me, like almost like the music of a black and white film reel depicting the kamikaze mission with a live pianist kind of accompanying these images. Back to my disclaimer about my inability to speak French. The next piece is called Vol de Nuit, in memoriam, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. That is like French, Norwegian, English attempt to say his name. It's the guy, anyway, who wrote The Little Prince, the book that you may know, and who also had several other novels for adults published. The guy who wrote The Little Prince, he, in addition to being a writer, he was also a pilot. And this piece starts with kind of simple ascending and descending melodic line, a kind of spacey motif. It's a little modernist sounding. It becomes increasingly complex and colourful. It's very beautiful. And it moves into a second section that again has a kind of repeating motif. And I read on the Bandcamp that this entire composition draws upon a Catholic hymn called Dies Irae, which is the Day of Wrath, which is a kind of hymn, both a poem and a piece of music that is about, Judgment Day, the end of the world. When I've listened to somebody singing this in a kind of old, early music style on the internet, this particular composition is the one where I could most clearly hear the way in which these two pieces of music are in communication with each other. This one also ends very dramatically, I guess, with the death of the author in a plane accident, and it ends with a very hard struck chord on the piano, and this chord resonates across 2 minutes. On top of this sustained chord comes a thin little voice, sounds almost like the voice of a child, singing a song, Seki, and this is in memoriam Daniel Kinet, 15th of the 7th, 1910. This man was the first avian fatality on Belgian soil and only the 12th in the world in 1910. He was originally somebody who flew balloons, and when aeroplanes took off, he also trained as a pilot, and he used to fly in air shows. I feel like the sound of this children's song is kind of like a child singing on the way to see the planes, on the way to see the balloons. I can't understand all the words, but at one point she's singing about the fun machines. I guess she's talking about the men in the flying machines, But the tragedy was that Daniel Kinet was thrown from his plane and injured and ultimately died. This recording is really interesting in the range of sounds that the composer produces on the piano, in the different styles and techniques of composition that are being applied, in the way that all the pieces kind of speak to each other to become a greater composition. And then you have the different narratives of each of these tragic figures, some very inspiring, some more frightening, some just more tragic. The interplay between adventure, excitement, play, display, breaking boundaries, taking chances, but then the ultimate risk, the ultimate cost that each of these people has died in the pursuit of these different goals. And then on top of that, again, a layer about us on this planet, earthbound, unable to escape. When will we understand that this is the only planet we're ever going to have? So I thought this was really beautiful, really interesting. I wanted to share it with you. I encourage you to go and listen to it. If any of this sounds interesting, I'm going to put the link to the Bandcamp in the description. I have been Vincent. This is Trumps of Twilight. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you again.